Hello, Paso, and welcome to Philosophic Dialogues from La Frontera. My name is Kim Diaz, and I'm a philosopher here at EPCC.
My name's Jules Simon, and I'm a philosopher from UT El Paso.
And today we are joined by Dr. Scott R. Stroud, who is a professor of communication studies at the University of Texas at Austin and program director of media ethics for the Center of Media Engagement. His most recent book is The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, Ambedkar, Dewey, and the Rhetoric of Reconstruction, published by the University of Chicago Press, which was also published as The Evolution of Pragmatism in India, an intellectual biography of B.R. Ambedkar by HarperCollins, India. He is the co-founder of the first Center for John Dewey Studies in India at Savitribai, Phule, Pune University. Did I get that right, Scott?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so maybe we can begin with our first question. How would you define democracy?
Well, first of all, Kim and Jules, thank you for having me on this show. It's an awesome chance to talk about democracy. Now, defining it's always the first step, right? And too often people point towards kind of formal, every once in a while, periodic things like voting or like decision-making procedures. And these are not foreign to what we point at when we want to point at or talk about democracy, but they aren't the core of it. And one of my philosophical leading lights is a philosopher named John Dewey. I know you two are familiar with him, and a lot of people have heard his name. But one of Dewey's kind of resounding, profound bass notes, as William James would put it, was the idea that democracy was a way of associating with other people. The people around you, in your neighborhood, the people around you in your country. So democracy, if I had to define it, would be, how we form a community with shared interests, and not just how do we live in suspicion of other people or watching out for the actions of other people or in competition with other people. So how do you form that shared community? That's the nature of democracy. And that's less a matter of voting every 4 years and more a matter of habits of how we communicate.
Oh, that's a really great start, Scott. I like the distinction that you make between sharing versus competing or kind of conspiring to get something in
Working together.
Yeah, working together. That's a good kind of platform that we can start with, that kind of idea. But, it's not something that people usually think about. And how do we get people thinking about that? Why is it important to think about sharing versus competing or...
I have a follow-up question, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I think of like a military dictatorship, for instance, right? Or it's still people working together. So I think what I want to emphasize from Scott's definition is working together but not being suspicious of each other, right? So because I can see how a country that is a military dictatorship, or for me the prime example might be Nazi Germany, for instance, right? Nazi Germans at that time were clearly working together, and they were a community of people. But I don't think that they were a democracy. So what is to clarify that, how can we set them apart as different?
A lot of the most authoritarian regimes, will claim in their title of their state's official title, democracy and such. And so, yeah, you have to pay attention to where the rubber meets the road. So are they creating a unified community? Maybe, but at what cost? And how flexible and adaptable is that community? So I think that's one thing that I would, say is a hallmark of democracy. And I'm not being particularly innovative here. I'm taking my lead again from John Dewey in his 1916 book, Democracy and Education, where he said, the key thing about the groups we're in and the democratic groups we want to form, is this kind of tension between letting individuals matter and having this interlinking of all the different groups. So it's bad if you matter, but only for one group, and that group doesn't coordinate or integrate with other groups. Maybe it's at war with those other groups. Or it's not good if the groups are all of one mind and then individual, differences are stamped out. So it's kind of a balance. I think, Dewey is getting at something, phenomenally important, that each of us, is this different mix of impulses and interests. The jobs are different that we want to do. Our talents are different. Our projects are different. Yet democracy is this kind of forming some basic unity out of that and not smashing that flat to form that unity. So I think that's one thing that's different. Nazi government did not tolerate dissent. It denigrated it in unofficial and official ways. It used overt force in many cases, when they had the ability to do this, to just destroy any opposition. So for someone like Dewey and, someone like me, deep Democrats, that look at democracy as a deep project, the worry there would be, this is just homogeneity through force. It's not that real voluntary democracy.
Thank you for clarifying that.
Well, let me follow up then on what I was beginning to ask about. Now, since you mentioned Dewey's book, Democracy and Education, the conjunction is important. So I think, connecting democracy to education is something that Dewey was really a pioneer about, basically. And maybe you could say a few words about that, because that's the thinking part. It's not a matter of just us being able to naturally get together and understand the differences that we have with each other, but still work together. There's a level of education that has to occur. And how do maybe you could say a few words of what you think about that, or maybe what Dewey thought about that.
The challenges Dewey was dealing with around 1900 and 1916, when he wrote that book, published that book, are still with us today, which is, how do you educate people to be good workers, that help the nation out economically, but also, to have jobs that they understand the importance of and see as more than drudgery. And how do they have skills to adapt to tomorrow's challenges? So what Dewey sensed around 1900 was that the old way of just lecturing, and filling their heads with information, from a higher level of the lectern down, that's just not going to work. Students forget stuff. Students, it doesn't engage the students' interests. We all know this in our class. Sometimes when I think there's an incredibly important point and I just want to explain it, sometimes it doesn't stick because the students don't see the relevance to it, and maybe they're thinking about their next TikTok video or something. So this is one of the challenges Dewey saw. It's still there for us. One thing I think that's fascinating, as Dewey, states bluntly in that book, we never educate directly. We educate by, indirectly forming environments. So formal education is the creation of a classroom environment that you're fairly confident will get across and habituate the right skills, along with them knowledge in these students. One thing that I think's been forgotten in that equation by a lot of philosophers, I'm in a department of communication, is that, that classroom is going to be intensely communicative. When Dewey talks about group problem solving or inquiry among a community of inquirers, what he's talking about is certain helpful ways of communicating, versus other unhelpful ways of communicating and not solving problems. So Dewey's theory, put it simply, I think is still exciting for us today, because we're grappling with those same problems. How do you form a community while you're teaching these skills and practicing them?
One thing, I haven't taught the book in a while, but I have taught it a couple of times, and Kim's also intimately familiar with it and with Dewey's work. But the diversity part of that communication, I think, is important, at least from Dewey's perspective, right? One draws all these different groups have to learn how to communicate with each other in a way that targets or draws from the richness of the social diversity. Would that be fair to say, to characterize it that way? Yeah.
The flip side to that, recognizing the diversity, is really a skill or capacity, and a capacity of imagination. You know, I think this is a key part to Dewey's ethics, is imagination, being able to see why there's a conflict here in the first place. You know, how many times have our students, you know, I teach ethics, it's just communication ethics or digital ethics, you know, they're in my department. But a lot of times, and I remember teaching in philosophy, that class was exciting because students would register and they'd come ready to argue. But the challenge was they always had they thought they had the right answer, whether it was abortion, whether it was, being mean or doxing on Twitter or X or whatever it's called this week. So, the challenge there was one of increasing their imaginative scope. You know, how could someone disagree with you on this content moderation issue? You know, and where might they be coming from? And then rhetorically, how might you enunciate your argument to maybe even get them to see your way as the right way?
Right.
Do you think that we live in a well-functioning democracy?
I don't think so. But, the asterisk would be, I don't think, many folks have lived in a well-functioning democracy. And, the biggest problem I see in our democracy, and there are folks that study this, political science in communication as well. So, a lot of people will have different takes on what's wrong. But one of the biggest things I see is polarization. The idea that we just cannot identify or relate to the other side. And quite the contrary, we take active steps to demonize these folks. They don't have any grasp on truth. They don't have any grasp on, kind of morality or virtue. Sometimes people are wrong, of course. Sometimes people are bad intentioned, of course. But, it probably won't be the case that 50% of a political community is totally wrong or totally evil. And it's for sure not useful to think they are. This is one of the challenges I think Dewey sets for us. And, it's still here in our democracy. It's there in India as well. Any kind of pluralistic, diverse democracy where people all think differently and they think they're right, you're going to have these troubles of how do I relate to someone who opposes everything I stand for, yet I still have to be next to them and form a community with them. That's kind of the standing challenge of democracy. And I don't think we're doing it that well yet.
No, now that you and Jules both talked about the classroom, I remember talking about this with one of our guests, that we want to, at least I know I do, I want to create that environment in the classroom that is democratic, right? Where instead of only hearing one voice, we hear dissent, and that dissent is taken up as a good thing because it allows us to test our ideas, right? And try to convince each other or show each other why this is better, or it lets us know our weaknesses so that afterwards we can be better for the sake of our community, our classroom. And so I'm wondering if maybe part of the problems that we have in our democracy is because our education itself is not democratic enough, right? Not democrat enough. And by that I mean
democratic in process.
Yeah, and by that I mean the hierarchy, right? We still in education have a very strong hierarchy. It's very medieval, for one. It's still very medieval. When we go to graduations, right, our outfits are straight out of a Harry Potter movie. There's that. And I think some disciplines lend themselves more to having for everybody to learn from each other. And even within philosophy, when I teach ethics, or intro to philosophy, or other classes that I've taught, the way that I teach it is by presentations. My students sign up to present, and so we teach each other. But when I'm teaching logic, I am not as democratic because I feel like I need to show them, hey, this is how you do a truth table, rather than somebody who doesn't have any knowledge of that skill learning how to do a truth table on their own in order for them to then teach all of us, right? And so for the sake of expediency, for the sake of time, I am the one that lectures. And so Yeah, because our students, ourselves, when we were students, were learning about our own agency and how to work with other people that we disagree with to work on a project together in order for us to achieve our goal, right? Which is to pass our class or get a good grade and move forward. So, since, as you mentioned, Dewey is emphasizing the process, the environment by which we learn, where we learn, that it's important for us to question, to disagree, and that actually makes us better. And that's where we test and try out and learn how to work with people that we disagree with instead of just voting them off the island, right?
Yes, in many cases, we can't vote people off the island. So, I mean, this is the paradox of democracy. We have to be in close proximity to these people, depend on these people. Even in a large nation like the U.S., where our fates are to a great extent united, because of the vicissitudes of history. And so, how do we form a community that's more useful than destructive amongst all these differences? There's no hope that we're going to totally persuade the other side or force them to think like us or get rid of them. So this is kind of the challenge of democracy, and I find it so fascinating. And you're getting at some important differences. What you're saying about education gets at some differences in topics. So obviously math is has a lot of things you need to know, like times tables, before you can start building houses for the debate club. This was one of Dewey's examples in one of his early books on education. His laboratory school needed a clubhouse for the debate team, so the kids were charged with designing it and building it, which meant math and carpentry, theoretical stuff along with practical skills. And so that's kind of his idea, is not to get rid of, the truths of mathematics or, the kind of procedures of logic, but, to try to integrate them into practice as much as possible, because practice is always what's going to be changing and pushing us forward. And practice always involves other people. This is the social aspect.
So this is a great conversation, a great dialogue already. Thank you so much. Speaking or addressing the issues like differences in subject matter or kind of the different skills we teach in our educational systems leads me to think, I do some work in institutions, and having to learn how to work with somebody else with different skills is related to the existing institutions we already have. Like, some democracies work better than others, right? And it's almost like, well, we have this long tradition of developing democratic institutions and now states, but how do we, diagnose what's going well in a democracy versus what's not going well, and how do we deal with those kinds of historical differences? Some democracies are more parliamentarian, some more federalist. What do you think about that?
That's one of the challenges, right? Is how do you evaluate the performance of democratic institutions or constitutions or even democratic habits? And a lot can be said there. I think one important thing would be kind of, the world's always changing. This is a commonplace in Dewey's thought. This is the last line from the Buddha, right? When he was dying, he said, "All is impermanence, strive on with diligence." And so, a lot of these great philosophers have noticed that the world is always going to surprise you. And these folks were even talking before Silicon Valley was doing all of its magic every few years with a new device or a new platform. So, I think one of the hallmarks of a functioning democracy is its resilience and its adaptability to these kind of changing, structures. Another hallmark it's integrated into that would be like how it deals with divergence. Does a democracy try to adapt by smashing flat any kind of disagreement? Now, of course, there could be violent disagreement that wants to destroy the grounds for any sort of future change, but there will always be heated disagreement, that stop short of force and violence. Now, what do you do with these people? They may be annoying, they may hurt people's feelings, they might actually emotionally hurt people. But what do you do with these folks? This is Twitter in a nutshell.
Yeah, or the bigger historical precedent, like in the French Revolution, how do you deal with the differences with those people you depose, right? Off with their heads, right? But in a newsfeed, I recently read about this woman who was standing in line getting ready to vote in this election cycle in the United States, and the people behind her were talking about, using the guillotine to knock off the heads of their opponents in the voting line, right? So there's some pretty kind of horrific habits and practices that we're dealing with on the ground in our democracy that are still with us, which is why this education part is so important. Another thought that struck me as you were talking was Dewey didn't title his book Democracy and Revolution. He titled it Democracy and Education, right? Because it's not the case that we're dealing with these changes, radical changes that have to depose the other, on a regular basis. I think what Dewey had in mind was this system that we are developing that's called democracy, right? That also includes not just flexibility but also stability. Like we want to create a system where we can adapt to the diverse peoples that are involved, but also one that's not going to self-destruct every election cycle or something like that.
There needs to be that kind of freedom from fearing you'll be purged. After, if you lose, it's existential. No, democracy you got to know how to win in democracy. You got to know how to lose in democracy. That's how I like to say it.
Yeah, that's a good point.
American politicians, especially, before the Trump era, they had trouble losing. You just tried to find a way to flummox your enemy next time. And this is the correlate to the lack of compromise in politics. But, it's a deep problem and it's hard to solve.
I want to make the most out of the fact that Scott has a very deep experience in communication.
Yeah.
And ask Scott some questions about communication. What is the relationship of democracy to truth? What do you think?
Well, sounds like you started from the premise that communication is largely about the conveyance of truth. And, that's reasonable. I see where you're coming from. That's what a lot of philosophers will say. But, a lot of our communication is to make people laugh or to inspire people. Think of a locker room speech. It's probably not true the bad team's going to win. But, if you tell them that, they definitely won't win. So, aspirational rhetoric is important. But yeah, democracy needs, true information. So obviously, truth has a very important role in democracy. Are the problems of democracy just related to misinformation or truth? No. I think some of it is how we, engage other people when we start to sort out whether they're true, saying something true or saying something false. This is why when I teach my classes on communication ethics, I draw from Dewey's kind of view of imagination being needed in these kind of communities of argument, communities of communication. But I also draw from another tradition that goes back, 2,500 years in the West, to the Greek sophists. Protagoras had an interesting way of teaching people for money. This annoyed Plato because Plato thought it was just the elites that needed to be taught. But, Protagoras said, if you come give me some money, I'll teach you how to be a powerful arguer. And the premise of Protagoras' message, from what we can gather, was what it was called the dissoi logoi technique, two accounts technique. And what he would do is very simple. He'd say, Kim, argue for universal health care. And you'd give a speech or construct one argument or many for universal health care. Then he'd say, okay, Kim, now give a speech against this. And then another level would be you argue versus Jules about this maxim or proposition. Today this technique survives in switch side debating, A lot of our universities have debate teams. A lot of our high schools have debate teams. And the idea there is they have a resolution, and they often have to take pro and con views on it, even if they don't personally agree with that. And some people say that's mere sophistry. But, the deeper point is it's teaching these habits of charitable argumentation.
Right.
If you're forced to argue for a position you're not naturally or initially inclined to believe, you might see some ways it could be reasonable. Even if you don't think it's ultimately better than what you had before, you've had to argue it. So this is kind of how I teach ethics. I try to get my students to see the debate. We don't pick no-brainer cases. So, for instance, there's no debate over the Holocaust being kind of unadulterated evil, but things like content regulation on social media. This is a choice between two important values. There's not just one side that's clearly right and one side that's clearly wrong. So these are kind of my two guiding lights when I try to teach students the role of communication, truth, and argument in democracy. How do you figure out in a charitable way what your opponent's arguing, and then how do you counter that in a way that might reach them?
Yeah, and that's really important because what most of us do is confirmation bias, right? I feel a certain way about a certain topic, and then I research that to make my point more convincing. But none of us take the time to try to understand where the other side is coming from. There's nothing, and full disclosure, there's very little in me that wants to even entertain what I already know is wrong, right? But there is so much value there because if I actually engage and try to understand with the problems and be charitable about why they feel that way, that actually allows me to understand my position better, and when all is said and done, to actually reach out and work with the people that I disagree with, if I were to win. And if I were to lose, again, I understand the other side better. And we live with the people that we disagree with. So what about, so there's value, no matter whether we win or we lose. The exercise of trying to genuinely understand the other side, I think, is really important. What can we say about when the other side is lying? They're communicating lies. Go ahead.
Yeah, or the other side stands for something that maybe existentially threatens you.
Right.
So yeah, like when you were saying what you were saying a second ago, I was kind of torn. I agree with it as an ideal, but of course I'm anticipating, an enemy saying, well, these people over here, and they point at their political opponents, or if they win, they're going to take away my rights, or, pass policies that dispute my existence or my suffering or my people's suffering. And so, this is a challenge because politics for too long, and communication in politics, has been pursued as kind of a zero-sum, warlike endeavor. How do you marshal force to destroy the speed bumps your opponents represent, to your policies? And so entering into that with this dialogic mindset, that's what I kind of take your take as representing. How do I build bridges with these people, and bring us closer together? And I think Dewey's on that same wavelength. It's tough because it almost sounds like you're going to try to build bridges, and these people are in the business of hitting you with a hammer or a baseball. So they're attacking, and you're trying to find common ground, and you'll lose that because that's automatically in this warlike setting. So it's a tough battle, and I'm not. I think there's a place for aggressive argumentation. Sometimes when you have to stand up for yourself, you got to do something that's very critical in that kind of negative sense. But you can't do it all the time, because you won't build those bridges and you can't build the community, yet you'll always be around people who disagree. So yeah, this is the ongoing challenge I face.
This is circling around another problem. We have some big ideas in our list of questions here, like what is truth, what is democracy? And there's limits to freedom too. I mean, there's limits to how much free play can enter into. I mean, being flexible is one thing, but we shouldn't be free to just knock somebody up at the side of the head with a bat, right? Or something like that. You know, if I disagree with you, there has to be restraint as well, and a certain kind of discipline as in a democracy. It's not just a free-for-all that everybody gets to say what they want to say, right, or do what they want to do. I mean, there has to be, in the case of the example I gave before of this woman standing in a voting line, what the court set up was surveillance cameras. And so she resorted to going to the sheriff who was overseeing the voting booth, the voting place. And they had security cameras set up. And so hopefully, you know, they're going to be able to identify, you know, the fact that, A, she's telling the truth. These people threatened her, right? They threatened her being in line to vote. You know, they were intimidating her, attempting to intimidate her, right? But I think we need to, and on a practical sort of basis, there has to be this understanding that in a democracy, we want to guarantee freedom for people to express themselves, but there also has to be limits, you know, to how we can express.
You know, the history of jurisprudence around First Amendment and true threats is fascinating. And, you know, clearly a threat is not protected speech. The challenge is if I am, you know, fashion myself an amateur rapper and rap about doing violence to cops I don't like in my local community, is that a threat, or is that, you know, wanting to be like Eminem or something, or Ice-T? So yeah, you know, there's these kind of borderline cases that we'll have to figure out, but clearly there's limits. One of the things I'd like to mention, you know, and we chatted about this before the show, you know, one of my recent person I'm studying a lot on is a Indian, you know, theorist really, and an activist named Bhimrao Ambedkar. And Ambedkar was a student of John Dewey's at Columbia University, 1913 to 1916, you know, right when Dewey was writing Democracy and Education. And, you know, I never really appreciated, you know, my students might take from me things that are, you know, over here in this class, but not here in my article. So as I got into studying Bhimrao Ambedkar and what he thought about Dewey, what he liked, what he didn't even hear, you know, I really, you know, kind of understood the, you know, scattered nature of intellectual influence. You know, we don't just take someone's thought one piece and then continue it. So one of the things Ambedkar saw in Dewey speaks directly, Jules, to what you're talking about with limits. You know, Ambedkar saw in Dewey that French Revolution motto. He heard it in Dewey's classes. I know this for a fact because I found the lecture notes, you know, from Ambedkar and his fellow students. You know, Dewey didn't make much of that motto in his work. It doesn't serve as a moral touchstone. But, you know, you look at the stuff Ambedkar wrote when he went back to India, when he started attacking casteist attitudes. He himself was untouchable, now called Dalit. And, you know, he was from the lowest rungs of society. You know, and so he was very interested in critiquing the kind of caste hierarchy that many people around him took very seriously and just crushed him and his freedom. So one of the things he would do in critiquing that is he'd say, look, the ideal democracy balances liberty, equality, and fraternity. You know, so think about it. You know, obviously something that's oppressive takes away the oppressed group's freedom, and it doesn't treat them equally. You know, and the things you want to do to get that back, you know, probably can be effective even if they're violent, you know, but that's where that third value comes in, fraternity. You know, Ambedkar thought, like Dewey, you know, and he's quoting Democracy and Education when he's writing this stuff back in India, you know, that you need to find a way to share interest in a community. So you can't just beat your oppressors because you could become as oppressive as they are. Right. So how do you get equality? How do you reclaim liberty without compromising fraternity or fellow feeling among community members? You know, that balance is tough. It's going to be, you're going to have to rebalance every, you know, year. It's not something you're done with and then you're set. So I think, you know, I like his strategies in some ways better than Dewey's. The idea that democracy involves this tense balance, and you'll never be satisfied, but you'll always be charged with going forward and finding new ways to balance these things.
It's an interesting. Now that you bring up Ambedkar, I thank you for that. Your works revolves around that in some ways. A lot of your work. What fascinates me about Ambedkar is that he was Dalit or untouchable, right, and was able to rise to such a level in Indian political history that he was the correct me if I'm wrong, but the chief architect for the Constitution, right?
Yeah, one of them, one of the only members of the committee that didn't die or come in late or get retasked. So yeah, his hand was there in a lot of the Constitution.
It's one thing having the ideal of a kind of education that guarantees, liberty, equality, and fraternity, but setting it in writing constitutionally is another dimension. And I think, that's important to say too, that there are practices that depend upon these documents that we write, this constitution that, holds a people together over generations. And that gets back to that stability issue I brought up earlier, and I think Ambedkar pretty clearly saw that, and which is why he then invested his time and effort into working on the Constitution. So maybe you could talk about that. Like, I think there are challenges to constitutional democracy and real benefits, though, that we have this document that we've formed that we can refer to.
Yeah, you're spot on with, many points there, Jules. And I mean, yeah, Ambedkar saw the value in a constitution. And, back up a second, what happened in the 40s was, Nehru was going to be the first prime minister of India. And to his credit, Nehru didn't agree with Ambedkar and everything, but he realized how smart Ambedkar was, regardless of his caste, regardless of his background. He knew his education. So Nehru tasked Ambedkar to help write this constitution. And so it was one of these kind of cabinets of opposites, where you include some of those people that don't agree with you to make your ideas stronger. So Ambedkar engages the very laborious process of writing and drafting and revising and subjecting to parliamentary debate the Constitution in the 1940s. Eventually, a version of it's passed around 49 or whatever becomes official. And then what happens is absolutely key. In 1951, Ambedkar is still Nehru's law minister. And, Ambedkar starts championing this bill called the Hindu Code Bill. And this bill, as I understand it, I'm not as interested in Ambedkar's, legislative stuff as I am in his more philosophical or activist aspects. But, the story is shared by everyone who talks about it. Nehru said he would support this bill, which would reform aspects of Hindu society that the conservatives didn't like. Things like widow remarriage, wife inheritance of property over a son, things like this that we might take for granted. And so Nehru supported it. And then the conservatives came out of the woodwork and started making largely religious arguments against it. And Nehru pulled back his support. And Ambedkar then pens a very public resignation letter, and resigns in disgust. Now in some ways that was epochal because Ambedkar was spending so much time in politics, that he couldn't really fulfill this conversion movement that he had in his mind, and he was slowly, since 1936, telling his Dalit audiences, convert out of Hinduism and into something else that gives you self-respect. So in some ways, his loss in politics in 1951 was, history's gain, because what happens after 1951 is he embarks on a series of, some 200 speeches at least to huge crowds of, Dalit or untouchable audiences. And he proselytizes Buddhism as the way to their salvation. And beyond that, in his last 2 years of life, he dies in 1956, he hurriedly pens and revises this book called he called it the Buddhist Bible, but it's called the Buddha and his Dhamma in its final form. It comes out the year after he died, but he coalesces all the Buddhist suttas into this kind of easily transferable book of Buddha's message. And it's just fascinating because he calls the Buddha's message a social gospel, and he aligns it against Marx. So it's a different form of Buddhism than you'll see if you just read the suttas about enlightenment in the Theravada or Mahayana tradition. So just like John Dewey, Ambedkar wanted a religious faith that was democratic, that didn't just say you had the right truths and everyone else should shut up. So he's just fascinating case study in how history is made by intelligence, hard work, and sometimes just the swinging of fate and fortune. Getting kicked out of politics lets you go into something else.
Oh, but that what you just shared with us about his the way he moved from politics to a larger social, engaging in a larger social movement. That's fascinating. I mean, that's fascinating, and deeply philosophical.
Go ahead.
because he had to draw from this, from this deep philosophical tradition that came from India itself and is part of Indian self-identity, right? I don't know, that kind of activism is a really different kind of education. It's not the kind of institutional academic education that we're used to, but it's a deep kind of transformative education that, I think is still, very much in play in India.
I would like to, freedom has so many meanings, right? And the question is, what role does freedom play in democracy? And maybe we can talk about Ambedkar and the lack of freedom that he experienced in the caste system, and him turning to Buddhism, and he fought for political rights, but then when he was kicked out of politics, went beyond politics for more expensive freedoms. What is for you the relationship between freedom and democracy?
Can I just add to that one line though? And as you're saying that, but I'm thinking we think of democracy as kind of a modern Western phenomenon. and here, you introduce this with, we introduced this with Ambedkar, and the way he was able to fuse his understanding of Buddhism to the modern political, or our modern era. I think that's, remarkable.
Yeah, because sometimes, in theory, democracy ought to protect our freedom, right? Everyone's freedoms, with limits, but it doesn't always, and so clearly it didn't with Ambedkar. So he moves into a different type of freedom.
Yeah, part of the challenge is freedom to do what, to become what. And in the West, a lot of times freedom is, I can say whatever I want to say. Think of the freedom of speech, the idea that I can just let what's in my head out without fear of government reprisal, especially. In the Indian tradition, you get the opposite. Freedom is freedom from a lot of the attachments and pain causing features of this world, namely desire. And Buddhism has a certain reading of this as well in its older traditions. And that just wouldn't do for Ambedkar. Ambedkar, for instance, was fascinated by the Jains. Some Jain monks were the last people to see him alive, the night before he died on December 6th, in December 1956. And, he was always fascinated by Jainism, but, the Jain view of ahimsa was not a particularly activist one. It was do no harm, but, you have trouble doing a lot of things if, as the Jains say, you're like a heated iron ball rolling through the world, destroying anything that's in its path. So you look at Jain monks today, many of them try to severely curtail the harm they're causing to microorganisms or even larger organisms. And that curtails, they're not out marching, they're not flying across the world to do activism. So Ambedkar wanted this kind of philosophy that could grab people like a religion, but that wasn't subject to some of the kind of known, in his idea, the known drawbacks of these religions. So Buddhism was perfect because it was largely a blank slate in India. There weren't many Buddhists, there weren't existing monastic orders and hierarchies, yet everyone in India would probably know about Buddhism. So 1936, 1935 actually, he says famously, "I was born a Hindu, but I won't die a Hindu." And then 1936 on, he starts telling his Dalit audiences to convert out of Hinduism. But he never quite says what to convert to until 1949, thereabouts. And that's when Buddhism, is in his speeches, and he says, hey, this is the faith that you should convert to, or the philosophy, really. And then to help it out in 1956, he does two important things. He finalizes that Bible, the Buddhist, and Buddha and his Dhamma is the final version. The earlier version of it he wrote in 1951 was the Buddha and his Gospel. That was his original title for it. So he has this kind of Western view of what that text should be like. He writes that. The other thing he did that was fascinating was there's, not really a hard and fast Buddhist conversion ritual. So he designs a ritual, to convert himself and his wife in 1956, and 500,000 in the audience after him, to Buddhism. So, it's a nice convergence of his philosophy of, we have the right to reconstruct ourselves and who we think we are and what value we think we own. And this kind of political activism that's fighting constitutional battles for equality and social battles against caste inequality. They converge right there at the end of his life, luckily 6 weeks before he dies.
Thank you so much.
That was great.
I want to go back to your initial definition of democracy as a community. And I think part of the problem is obviously that whenever we have a disagreement with people within our community, we want them out of that community. We don't feel like they really belong in our community. They don't add anything right? Because, well, for me, dissent is actually a good thing because, again, it makes us, it's an opportunity for us to learn how to work together right? But not everybody thinks of dissent as a good thing. Some of us think that dissent is bad, and so we need to get rid of it and get rid of those voices. So having said that, my question, and again, because you do communication, so to me, that is so, that is such a strong aspect of a healthy democracy. The title of our show is A Philosophic Dialogue. We want to learn and hopefully share some of, maybe some of the stuff that we say here will resonate with someone and they might change their mind, I'm not sure, right? But it's in this process of talking that I think it's, I don't know, like the fabric of democracy, right? So part of it anyway. So what would you say is the ethical justification for democracy?
It's very much a pragmatic one. If you have to live with these people and you want, you want some good things out of life, pleasurable things out of life, happiness, and these other folks want that as well, you owe this to them. For instance, Ambedkar was always, I've looked at the drafts of his writings, he was always playing with this kind of Kantian argument that every person is an end in themselves, just like you, the source of value, and needs to be treated like that regardless of whether they're a criminal or a normal citizen or what. There's certain kind of baseline conduct you can't go below in regard to these folks. He toyed with that line of reasoning. And I think ultimately, you always see these struck out of his drafts. Ultimately he went with the pragmatist view, which is, it's just so much more fulfilling, for me and my projects, and you and your projects, if we have this sort of community that allows us to be different and to win and to lose and keep going in the future. So that's the ideal, at least. Now in practice, it's tough to sit there and listen to someone talk something very extreme and then learn from it. You want to say, I want to say why it's all wrong. So that, I totally acknowledge this is the paradox of democracy. We need to be open, but it's just so hard. And there's so many things we don't think we need to be open to that, but those people are pointing at us too and calling us that as well.
About this, having to sit and listen to the opposing point of view, but in kind of practical, pragmatic matters, there comes a point where we need to say, we need to fact check somebody, or we need a judge to say, no, this is just not acceptable, right? Even if I'm going to be democratically open, to you, there's a certain line. There are certain lines that shouldn't be crossed. It seems to me, anyway.
I didn't mention this earlier, but when Ambedkar presented the Constitution, to the would-be parliament, that would be authorized by this Constitution, he said, look, this is going to, today, India is going to have this kind of political democracy, but it's never going to last if it's not built on a social democracy. For instance, the Constitution outlaws untouchability, but he never could find a way to really effectively, or with the help of others, pass into law legislation against social boycotts. Think about that, right? What an untouchable was always in fear of, because they depended upon getting access to the town water supply, or being able to take roadkill effectively and then eat it. This was one of the tasks, of some of Ambedkar's fellow untouchables, was to remove livestock and then they inevitably ate it. But if the society said, look, you can't do that anymore, or you can't get our water, they would die. So social boycott, this kind of exclusion or ostracism from social necessities, something very difficult to legislate. Maybe the water, you can get around it, but what if everyone stops shopping at your store? It's hard to detect that. It's hard to detect the motives for that. Yet that's a social problem. That's people thinking that I don't want to be touching produce touched by these people. That's kind of the framework Ambedkar's working with. Untouchability was, you'd touch something and then someone else is afraid to touch it because of that initial touch. And so, those two levels, regardless of the context, in India or the U.S., below the political institutions, do you have some kind of habits that feed on those? In John Dewey's Creative Democracy speech, a speech from 1939, he famously says, we think of institutions as, shaping us, which is kind of in line with his educational thought. But he said, another way to think about this is think about institutions like laws or governments as expressing the kind of habits and attitudes that people already have. Because unless you're in a extreme dictatorship, you're not going to have one person just coming up with all this stuff. It's going to have the buy-in and support and enthusiasm of so many people. So that's a fascinating dialectic. Institutions shape us. In some cases, we shape those institutions. How do we go forward?
Our last question is, would you say that peace is a democratic ideal?
Definitely. If you mean by peace the failure or the limiting of the forces to persuasion, and not violent coercion. Because peace is often opposed to open states of war. I mean, the trickier thing is when we find ways to use language that exert a force almost as violent, as physically hitting someone. And again, Dewey in that 1939 piece, it's fast, all these thinkers, I always find that don't gloss over the tough to understand parts. He was, speaking, when Hitler was taking over various parts of Europe. I think he just invaded Poland. There was some knowledge that these kind of concentration camps were happening. And Dewey says, look, what's Dewey complaining about in that speech? He says America's got to watch for the kind of alienating, enemy-making rhetoric inside of its borders, as much as watch out for Nazis and Nazi aggression over there. And, part of me wants to say that's odd. It seems like the world conquering ambitions of, the Wehrmacht is the big threat. But the point is, after you beat a military opponent, what replaces that in your communities? What kind of communication? And is it forceful? Is it calling people names, intimidating them? If we had more time, you could think about this in terms of cancel culture, which is a marshaling of force and social boycott sort of tactics that, there's something that you see as legitimate about counter speech like that. And there's also a worry that we're resorting to just more clever forms of force to beat each other up or to harm each other. And, that's kind of against the spirit of democracy.
Yeah, and in closing, I want to say that, besides thanking you for such a wonderful dialogue, I think that the vision of what we want to avoid should at least be tempered by what we want, which is this kind of peaceful kind of dialogue that we're having today, you know, that we can actually talk about these really tough issues in really deep and meaningful ways. And I think that's what we've done this session with you. So we thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both for having me on the show, and good luck with your future episodes as well, and with democracy, however we come to touch that topic.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. And we want to thank our crew also and our viewers, and please join us next time.